Okay, hey, wealth builders. Welcome to Bitcoin Hard Talk episode 31. It's Friday again, and we are going live with everything that's happened this week in Bitcoin, in macro, in geopolitics. And then in part two, we're going to be covering what I think is a really interesting topic, and that is the oil sector in US, the energy sector in US, and how it relates to Bitcoin mining and the geopolitical environment that we find ourselves in today, as well as the 2024 elections and everything that's happening there. So we got a bunch that we're going to cover today, and I'm going to jump straight in with this week in Bitcoin. So we are on a flurry of what's known as F13 forms came in today. What the hell is an F13 form? Well, it's a required form by a financial institution when they have, or they've made an investment, or they have any type of position that's above about $100 million or more. And we saw tons of financial institutions that have bought Bitcoin through the Bitcoin ETFs. We saw so many disclosures that there was announcement after announcement from bank, financial institution that was saying that they now have a greater than $100 million position, some of them in the $1 billion positions, in the Bitcoin ETF. So financial institutions are officially in. In fact, we had 937 financial firms that disclosed a greater than $100 million position in Q1 2024 in the Bitcoin ETF. To put that in context, the gold ETF had about 95 firms that were invested in this quarter versus over 900 in the Bitcoin ETF. So obviously it's a new one. But speaking of which, we also had a little bit of progress and a little bit of announcement on the ETH ETF side. The financial weapons of mass destruction and the financial gangsters called BlackRock and JP Morgan, they're obviously trying to take over the proof of stake ecosystem by gobbling up as much ETH as they can, putting it in their ETF, so that they can then control the governance of Ethereum. But they gave comments recently this week on the ETH ETF, and basically they were making applications, and they said that it does not really matter whether the SEC thinks that Ethereum is a security or not, because they believe that they can just go ahead anyway. And that adds more speculation into the market. Why would you have to wait for clarity on the SEC to decide, excuse me, whether they think ETH is a security or not? And just after that announcement, a couple of the ETH ETF applications, which was ARK Invest and 21 Shares, they decided to update their applications. And obviously that is all disclosed. But they decided to remove staking from it. Now, you all know that a Bank to the Future is a regulated securities business and the longest standing company in Bitcoin. We allow people that want to take a little bit more risk to stake some ETH, convert everything into Bitcoin, and use it as a mechanism for making sure that they own more Bitcoin every single month, or they can auto compound it and create a compounding effect if they want to stay in ETH. But the ETFs, it looks like they're all adjusting their applications to take ETH staking out of the equation, because that drives into the video that we covered a while ago on whether ETH is a security or not. Seems like it's an adjustment and a change of position since they moved over to ETH staking. So really, we don't know right now, and it doesn't really matter. But the ETH ETF could be approved, and then it can continue its case. Like the SEC can continue to sue the different companies that play around in the ETH ecosystem, like Uniswap and Consensus. And really, it just makes for more volatility because Bitcoin, ETH is a higher risk play with lots of uncertainty that changes all the time. It hasn't got the commodity-like properties of Bitcoin, but we shall see. And BlackRock and JP Morgan said, go ahead anyway. And let's see if they have more power than the SEC. We shall see. Another crazy thing happened this week was that the Tornado Cash developer what was his name? I think, sorry if I butcher the name, Alexei Pertsnev. But anyway, he was found guilty of money laundering for creating software that allowed people to mix their Ethereum to obfuscate the transactions in the blockchain. And while whatever your thoughts are on Ethereum, it also has implications on Bitcoin. This is a fight for freedom. Freedom to be able to transact, freedom of speech, and freedom of privacy to be able to transact peer-to-peer. We shall see, but we need to definitely watch what happens with the Samurai wallet case. This isn't necessarily a good progress in America. If you didn't watch the attack on Bitcoin that I covered in previous episodes of Bitcoin Hard Talk, I digress, but you can watch those videos as well and catch up. Really, the 2024 election, Trump, Biden, and RFK, they're all making their crypto stances known. They all use it in order to try. I remember RFK went over to the Bitcoin Miami conference and said, important announcement. We love Bitcoin so much that, of course, all of you can go donate to my political contribution in Bitcoin. So it's a bit of a money grab as well. And Trump, obviously, he's been launching NFTs and it previously took a very negative stance on Bitcoin, saying he loves the dollar, so he hates Bitcoin. But now when he was questioned recently, he said that he doesn't think that Biden even knows what crypto is. And obviously, he's looking for the crypto vote now. So that came out. And I'm going to be covering a little bit more on the political side at the end, because I'm going to be covering everything about the US Bitcoin mining sector, the energy sector, and the oil sector, and how it relates to the geopolitics as well. But there was an interesting thing as well. One of the states, Wisconsin in America, they disclosed that they have put 1% of their portfolio into the Bitcoin ETF. Now, that is state level investment in Bitcoin, protecting themselves from the Federal Reserve and the currency that co-opted America called the US dollar, that when the Federal Reserve decided to take over the creation of that digital currency from 1913, and then they removed it from the gold standard in 1971. And ever since then, the Federal Reserve has taken over and converted America from from capitalism to socialism, using that. And the state of Wisconsin is protecting themselves from the dollar by putting 1% in the Bitcoin ETF. We love any state that wants to get on board and protect themselves from the Federal Reserve. And it's a wise move to do that. There was more announcements from El Salvador, the central country of Bitcoin. They have now mined 474 Bitcoins. At today's price, that's worth approximately $29 million, using volcano-fueled geothermal power plants. Now, we did this at Bank to the Future in 2014. We created the first ever Bitcoin bond that was backed by mining in Iceland, and we used geothermal power and cooling, and all of the electricity was coming from volcano-powered electricity in Iceland. So it's great to see that that is now happening almost a decade later. Wow, 2024. Yeah, we started that in 2014. That was one of the highest performing investment products on Bank to the Future for our investors that put it in their retirement funds, and they were receiving thousands of Bitcoin as a daily dividend every day, backed by geothermal power. What else did we start to see? Oh, we also started to see, so US Senator Cynthia Loomis, sorry if I'm saying that incorrectly, they changed their profile to Bitcoin Laser Eyes after their pro-Bitcoin legislation passed in the Senate today. So there is definitely Bitcoin is becoming a political issue in America. And we talked about this a long time ago, many years on the channel, that Bitcoin would become something that would determine elections. So for those of you in America, that are voting based upon crypto and Bitcoin as a one policy vote, you're getting to see everything and that play out in real time. Now let's jump over to macro, Just before I jump over to macro and the geopolitical side and then the US energy side, do me a favor. I'm going to take a quick coffee. And will you hit that like button for me so that the algorithms, or retweet it, or wherever you're watching it, make sure the algorithms and more people get to watch it. Do that on 3 while I take a quick sip. 1, 2, 3. Lovely. Okay. So let's move over to the macro side this week. Well, oil prices, they had a slight shift downwards, which is normally a good sign in terms of geopolitical escalation in the Middle East. Once those prices start soaring, we have problems. We have problems because we saw, and we'll cover it a little bit more, it broke the US banking system in 2023 as sanctions escalated in the Russian side. But also US Treasury 10-year yield, it came slightly down as well. This normally implies that everybody is getting ready for a market recovery, and we go back to the quantitative easing Ponzi scheme rolling over and trying to find as many people that will buy US debt. And it implies that there's a little bit of, or the market's deciding that there's a lower risk of tension in the Middle East ever since we had the tit for tat between Iran and Israel. Things seem to have calmed down. However, we'll cover more in the geopolitical side, but there has been more escalation between Israel on the Lebanese front up north with Hezbollah as well. But we have reached record highs almost again. It tested it. The stock market is loving trying to get Biden reelected, and the Fed is trying its hardest to balance the Ponzi scheme and help its buddies in politics in order to try and make the economy look better as Trump and Biden go into their debates that they publicly said. And the stock market right now is approximately double the US GDP, which is a very overbought indicator. But the US gave up on free markets and capitalism a long time ago and said, we'll move over to socialism, where the Federal Reserve is in charge of our stock market. And we use the lobby groups in order to support those that have the assets at the expense of the middle class and those that don't own any assets. So we saw, that the stock market really going through. At the same time, obviously, 1/10 of Americans right now, actually, is it 1/10? Let's see. 1/5. 1/5 of Americans, I thought that sounded a bit low. They are completely maxed out on their credit cards as inflation continues to be subsidized, their cost of living crisis, using, as interest rates have gone up, they're trying to get those interest rates down so that they can try and roll over their debt. But we're getting record credit card delinquencies, record student debt, and we're hitting 3-year all-time highs. So, of course, we had this week the consumer price index and the producer price index. They came in pretty much as expected, and US inflation fell ever so slightly to 3.4%. Last week, we were talking about how the 2% will probably be given up, and transitory inflation doesn't exist because it's probably going to continue as systemic inflation at these levels of debt. Speaking of which, levels of debt, the US took the opinion to bail out Japan because they don't want Japan to sell any of those US treasuries. US needs countries to roll over their debt. Who owns the most treasuries as a sovereign nation? Of course, it is Japan, the largest welfare state in the world. They tried their currency was reflecting because of the fact that they are at debt levels that are unparalleled in the world. Now, obviously, the US always uses Japan as an example of how they can roll over their debt forever. And so when there is currency weaknesses, because Japan decides to subsidize its welfare state in order to create the illusion that everyone is okay and everyone's looked after, it breaks the currency system, and the US decided that rather than allowing it to do that, it would then swap over some of its currency for treasuries, and obviously the M2 money supply increases. It bails out Japan, and the USA gets to justify its debt to GDP of 130%, using the fact that Japan, as an example, has a debt to GDP of over 263%. They get dollars for free to sell it, and then they can buy yen in order to prop up the currency. And instead of having to sell those US treasuries, they get to get those dollars. They get to prop up their currency, and we get some financial engineering that makes it look like, trust me, bro, everything's okay between this relationship between Japan and US. We shall watch this one with interest. In the stock markets, it all returned to when you get your funny money being pumped into the markets, you obviously get the old short squeezes come back around, and retail thinking they can take on the powers that be in the hedge funds. And we saw all the speculation in GameStop start again with the old famous short squeeze. For those of you that didn't follow it last time, there was a bunch of naked short selling around GameStop. An ideological driven retail started using Reddit and posts in order to try and squeeze the short seller, because the short seller would have to buy back the stock, and that creates a pump in the price known as a short squeeze. And this all came around again. And it's always the same two stocks, GME and AMC, entertainment stocks. The short squeeze came back around. And for one day, in one day, they had to halt that stock 34 times combined in one day. GME surged about 110% in a day. Now, the retail said, it's us, we're covering the short. But I think it's the shenanigans from the hedge funds. They're playing those games. I think they're controlling that market. But we shall see. There is still a bunch of long positions from those that ideologically see it as the meme stock. And that also pushed out into the crypto markets and some of the meme coins gambling that we saw and we see in these, but whoever was short, they lost approximately between $1 and $5 billion, but depending on whether they had to cover that or not. I'm going to take a quick sip again. We're going to try and get through the coffee. If you can do me a favor, retweet this, like this, share this, whichever way you're watching. And we're going to jump over to the geopolitical side before we cover in part 2, the US energy, the US oil, and how it relates to US Bitcoin mining. Lovely. Been recovering a little bit from a bad throat recently. So hopefully we'll get through. The show must go on, and we must go live every week. Right. On the geopolitical side, Egypt said that it is going to be joining South Africa in the case that South Africa is taking against Israel, where it was determined that Israel is committing plausible genocide across the Palestine at the moment. Egypt is very significant because obviously Egypt recently had a financial weapon of mass destruction fired at it, where the IMF said, we'll destroy your currency. They corrected it. They lost 35% of their value. They're suffering from over 50% inflation. They got $8 billion from the IMF, and America decided to build its port and say that it's for humanitarian aid, while at the same time, Israel is in court saying that we are flooding Palestine with humanitarian aid. But at the same time, there is a famine crisis. Egypt is holding that border. Egypt has decided that this is a betrayal of the peace agreement between Egypt and Israel. And America has to build its port to pretend that it's bringing in humanitarian aid, and everybody's contradicting themselves as well. But at the moment, Egypt decided that it's going to join South Africa. From what it's seeing, it believes that there is a plausible genocide happening at the highest court of justice, the ICJ. And when Israel was making all sorts of claims about the humanitarian aid, there was outrage in the court. and people decided to butt in as well. So at the same time, the United States decided that it was going to threaten any country that signs any type of deal, any type of trade deal with Iran. So there was a massive increase in the sanctions. Now, obviously, Iran and Iran and Russia are the most sanctioned countries in the world right now. But those sanctions aren't working. So they decided that any country that wants to trade with Iran will also be sanctioned. At the same time, there is a massive push towards de-dollarization because all of those countries are saying if it can happen to Iran, it can happen to us. So India going through its elections right now, it decided that it wanted to speak out. And India said that the American dominance is over because of the BRIC corridor and the different type of trades that are happening. And we are moving to a multipolar world. I think that's good for America at the same time because it can get rid of all of that crazy expenses that goes and steals wealth from everyday people over to the military industrial complex by preventing peace in the Middle East through its occupations. And as we will cover in the oil section, there is a really good reason for America First people to want that right now. So at the same time, Russia is going harder and harder into Ukraine because US passed the $61 billion bill. Russia said, we'll double whatever you spend. And so at the same time, in this proxy war, NATO is leading to the complete death of more and more Ukrainians. Russia's coming in harder and preventing those peace talks and peace negotiations, while they're also taking a damn long time to get that equipment over, because the US military industrial complex needs to get all of that money that goes to Ukraine back into the hands. You suffer the inflation, the equipment gets sold, the companies get to report record profits, more and more Ukrainians and Russians get to kill each other, and NATO gets to continue its mission to weaken Russia and sell more and more weapons to the NATO members. And at the same time, we started to see a big escalation in the trade wars. So Biden now picks this moment to really take it to town to China and decides that it's going to start increasing all of its China tariffs. So all of the electric vehicles, 100% increase in tariffs. So if anyone is trying to buy electric vehicles from China in America, you have to pay 100% tariff. What does China do? China says, well, if you want to play that game, we can escalate as well. And you end up into an inflationary cycle, which puts down the value of US debt, and they get to roll over the Ponzi scheme a little bit more at the expense of its American people. And of course, the Fed gets to print more and more money, and solar and minerals and batteries and all these different things, they get higher tariffs, and the cost and inflation continues to go up. This was actually really Trump's policies, but obviously Biden is continuing them and trying to take credit for Trump's policies as they move forward into the debates as well. What else did we see? We saw the United States Senator. Which one's this? Let me make sure I get the names wrong. Sorry, I can't keep up with those who are bought by the Israeli lobby and the banking lobby. This one is Lindsey Graham. He actually suggested live on TV that there should be a nuclear bomb dropped on Iran and Palestine in order to defend Israel. Now, remember, the money goes across from America over to Israel. Israel then spends a chunk of it buying all the different politicians, 97% of all Congress members, 95% of all Senate. They receive funding from Israel that was printed by the Federal Reserve, gave you inflation, made the rich richer, the poor poorer, and then Israel gets to dictate those policies. And now the Congress people that are owned, or the Senate people that are owned, they get to say things like drop nuclear on Iran and drop nuclear on Palestine, which would end the world in approximately one day if that were ever to happen. Great policies. So as a response, we started to see as well, obviously, Israel now, as everything gets more and more crazy in terms of how America's supporting and demonstrating how that country is no longer a democracy, going deeper and deeper into socialism from capitalism. Israel decides, screw everyone, we're going to go deeper into Rafah, and puts another 600,000 refugees that now all need to go and go somewhere where they're already being bombed and there is no safe place to go. So the Russian president Putin, he comes out and he says that he is ready to expand his relations with all of the different Muslim countries and those different countries across the Middle Eastern regions that need to work with Russia and China. It's getting stronger and stronger and stronger. United States comes up and they fire a financial weapon of mass destruction. They decide that they're going to threaten any country that has any type of trade deal with Iran, as we said earlier. And the Iranian lawmaker, all happened this week, they came out and they declare that anybody that wants to obtain any type of nuclear bombs, that they will strengthen their relations with Saudi Arabia. And also they are declaring, certain officials said, that they have already obtained nuclear bombs. Now, this was known, and this is what all the sanctioning was about before. For those of you that don't know, Israel illegally has nuclear bombs. America doesn't say anything, but they sanctioned Iran for Israel as they started to grow their capabilities. And we've covered this many times. See some of the other videos in terms of the geopolitical side of how that all escalated. At the same time, there was a meeting between Russia and China this week. And they met Russia and Putin went over to Beijing. And number one on their policy, what did they have? Trying to push forward the BRICS, central bank digital currency, or the trade corridors and payment system between BRICS nations, and end the de-dollarization, end the US dollar dominance, because now 90% of all trade between China and Russia is already conducted in the ruble and the Chinese yuan and the Russian ruble, after they're deciding that they're trying to push for de-dollarization so that there can be a more fair relationship geopolitically. What else did China and Russia announce? Well, they said they're going to deepen their military relations. They're going to expand their joint military operations, and obviously the military industrial complexes in Iran, in Russia, in China, in America start to create military-based inflation, and we start to push all of those different military industrial complexes as the world had seen. There was an announcement from BRICS, they're looking to develop their decentralized financial system to end US dollar dominance. We shall see. Whether it's decentralized or not, I doubt it, but we shall see. They're saying that they're going to be using blockchain in order to do that. And it looks like Russia discovered a bunch of oil and gas reserves in what is it? Let me get the name of this right. In the British Antarctic territory, just making sure I say that one right. Apparently it contains an estimated $511 billion barrels worth of oil, which is 10 times the North Sea's output over the last 50 years. So with that in mind, what I would love everyone to understand is more on the geopolitical side and how it relates to the Bitcoin mining industry based upon oil and the energy sector in Texas. So we're going to jump over to part 2 of this, and we're going to cover as much as we can. So just while I'm doing that, I'm going to take a quick sip. Please retweet, please share, please like, please do whatever you do to help me get some more traffic. The more traffic we get, the more incentive I am to try and create better content to help everyone build and protect their wealth and help you understand why Bitcoin is one of the most important geopolitical solutions to everything that's happening right now. Okay, let's see if I can stick to half an hour. I doubt it. I got a lot that I'd love to share with you. So we're going to start with the growth of and the importance of Texas in terms of its geopolitical position to America and some of the trends that we are seeing right now to help you understand and make sense of everything that's happening, because your politicians won't tell you the truth. So we need to get down to it. And you know my way and my methodology. I follow the money in order to get to the truth and make sense of everything. So let's have a look at Texas. Texas, I visited Austin around about 2019, 2020, can't remember. Last time I went. But Texas is now the second largest US state by GDP, just below California, I believe, number one. Texas state GDP is approximately $2.35 trillion right now. That's approximately the same GDP as Russia. That's about $2.2 trillion. And that's because it's on par with Russia in terms of its importance in oil, in energy, and in, more important, with Bitcoin mining as well, as a result of some good moves. So if Texas were a country right now, it would actually be the 8th largest economy by nominal GDP in the world. That's actually ahead of Italy and Canada. In 2022, to give you some stats as well, Texas exported about $486 billion worth of products. That's about a quarter of all US exports combined across the entire United States. Texas is the most important state in the United States due to one thing: oil, gas, and energy. Oil, gas, and energy is an industry that pretty much changed the geopolitical game in across the Middle East. It helps you understand a lot of the tensions. It helps you understand a lot of the relations with China and Russia. And it helps you understand the importance of America becoming America first and retreating from its military industrial complex in the future, in my opinion. The reason is because let's go way back. Let's talk about 125 years ago, and we'll come all the way up to the present day of Bitcoin mining. But Texas, oil became really important approximately 125 years ago in 1901. Notice how everything started in that pre-Federal Reserve, pre-World War I era, where the world changes. I'm going to be covering more on that in an animation that I'm currently working on. I'm going to be releasing it. We're working on it right now, and I'd love to help you understand. In 2020, I did a free 4-part video series on retirementplanb.com where I shared, and that's all in Simon Dixon in the BitcoinHardTalk membership portal if you want to get back to the archives. But I did an animation where I shared about 5,000 years of monetary history in 20 minutes. I'm going to try and do the same in help you understand the money that helps you understand some of the proxy wars that we're in right now. But at that time, in 1901, the population of Texas was about 3 million. It's now about 30 million. Interestingly, that is very similar to Saudi Arabia, but the difference is that Texas needs to supply most of the oil for all of the 330 to 350 million, whatever it is in America right now. But Saudi Arabia can export all of that as well. But in 1901, way back before the Fed took over America, oil was discovered in East Texas. And that basically changed US and Texas forever. This was the largest oil field ever discovered at that point. And it was discovered shortly after, in the decades ahead, using the same technology in South Texas, then in North Texas, and then in the 1920s, the biggest field was discovered in West Texas. So Texas was covered from north, south, east, and west. And between 1901 and the end of World War II, Texas became the basically dominant oil producer in the US. And the US became the world's largest oil producer round about that time. Now, remember as well, US successfully managed to fund and produce oil for a lot of the different countries that were involved in the war and blowing each other up. But at the time of the Industrial Revolution, they managed to stay out of the war other than getting loans and managed to redefine money so that a lot of the gold from Germany and everything went back to America as a result as well. But this gave the US real geopolitical power and influence at the same time as the fall of the British Empire, because Britain was getting blown up as part of World War I and World War II. And during World War II, the US provided nearly 6 of every 7 barrels of oil to the Allied forces that were fighting against Germany and Japan in World War II. If you remember as well, that really became an important moment because US was producing 6 to 7 barrels of oil. They profited significantly from World War I and World War II. The military-industrial complex was rampant, and they were at the end of an industrial revolution, and they managed to not get bombed as well. But the US decided that it was going to do an oil embargo upon Japan because it was part of the Allied forces with Germany. And that obviously later led to Pearl Harbor. Pearl Harbor was when the Japanese then attacked America. Well, actually, it wasn't America. It was Hawaii, and Hawaii wasn't a state in America, but they made out it was certainly attack because it was a US base in Hawaii. And obviously, if you remember as well, if you've watched the old films, what's the name of the film? Put it in the comments if you remember the name of the film that went through the atomic bomb, where America essentially put the first nuke in the world, and they blew up 200,000 people in Japan, in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, that Japan is still suffering nuclear issues from today in terms of their environmental impact. That was after really truce was being negotiated, but that really ended, and they used German intelligence in order to recruit for the US military-industrial complex. But what they really got to do was prove their military might to the Russian Soviet Union at the time. And that really kicked off the Cold War, the end of the physical war, and it kicked off the Cold War. And the oil industry effectively became the entire economy and the entire growth of Texas after World War II. So after World War II, Texas and US, they basically dominated, and it became the whole industry. The post-World War II economy became a massive boomer. That's when the boomers were having a great time, and they're all retiring right now from the children that they produced after World War II. And the demand for US oil went through the roof, and it started to completely outstrip and outpace the growth of the US population. And therefore, US couldn't produce enough oil to cater for all the demand, and it had to actually start importing oil. And this is when we started to see some of the different relationships with the Middle East and some of the destabilization effects. Now, remember, the British Empire was the one that created all the different imaginary lines in the Middle East, and they put all of their shahs in place and all of their leaders and the British puppets in place. And said, you can be king of this place, you can be king of that place, you can be king of Saudi Arabia. And they implanted them in order to put together pro-British policy. And as the British started to fall, the America started to take over a lot of those relationships. And then Saudi Arabia, actually, because it had extreme skepticism for the British people after everything that it had done in its country with its oil fields, it decided to work with the US instead. And they had, companies that were created to mine oil in Saudi Arabia using U.S. relationships and U.S. companies. Roundabout in 1946, let's see, the first large-scale shipment of oil from Kuwait as a result of this exploration arrived in the U.S. So by 1948, the U.S. became a net importer of oil. And that was for the first time right after the war, because the economy needed so much oil in order to grow, and it had to get it from Saudi Arabia. And the US became completely dependent upon the crude oil given for decades and decades from the Middle East. and it started to become more and more dependent. At that time, it had relationships with Iran because the British implanted the pro-American and the pro-British Shah to rule over the nation. And so, by that, at that time, Iran was an ally with America, and it could get a lot of and meet a lot of these needs for its oil imports. By 1970, US oil production started to peak. And this was around the time when we started to see the 1971 economic effect. So by 1971, what happened? Well, a bunch of gold was leaving because America needed to import so much oil. And so in 1971, the Nixon shock happened. It removed the convertibility of US dollar to gold, which was the world order. Okay, so 1971, they removed the convertibility of the US dollar to gold in order to stop the gold reserves leaving America and draining as a result of all these imports. And the Fed could keep printing and get the US government deeper and deeper into debt and everyone deeper and deeper into debt to remove capitalism from the US, convert it to socialism. And the final piece was the 1971 Nixon shock. Covered that in many, many different videos. But that's when the US became a fully fiat currency. And so that's what it needed. And by 1972, approximately 83% of all US oil imports were coming from the oil-rich countries in the Middle East. So this relationship between the Middle East and America became geopolitically important. In 1973, the US, now there was tensions in the Middle East at that time, and the US decided that it would go against its Middle Eastern allies that were supplying a lot of the oil that it needed and depended upon, and it decided to support Israel in its war against the armies of both Egypt and Syria in the 1973, what was called the Yom Kippur War. So this is 1973. This is prior to the Iran independence, and then America and Israel relations, making sure that those relations were reversed as well. But at that time, OPEC, which is the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, they are a cartel of all the largest oil producers. As a result of US support for Israel against the Syria and Egypt allied forces, the OPEC decided to put an embargo, just like US put upon Japan. The OPEC decided to put an embargo upon the US and other Western allies. And they started to create a financial weapon of mass destruction through those oil embargo, which obviously was a technique learnt from America as it placed it upon Japan during World War II. At that time, if you were around, if anyone remembers, the price of gasoline in the US went through the roof. It skyrocketed more than fourfold, and long lines of people and Americans in petrol stations and gasoline stations became the absolute norm in the US. Recognize that from around about 22, 23, when we had the same type of relationship where America went over to Saudi Arabia after the Russian invasion in Ukraine, and instead Saudi Arabia decided to align itself with Russia and keep those prices higher. Well, the same thing happened around about this time. And the US, the home economy became very, very vulnerable to attack by the powers that essentially control all the world's oil. Basically the oil production within the US, it kept decreasing. The demand for oil in the US kept increasing. And by the end of about 1973, President Nixon, who removed the convertibility of US dollar to gold, supported the Federal Reserve in their rampant money printing, put together a policy which obviously was really important, and said the primary policy of the US is to become energy independent within 1 decade. Now, it actually took them over 40 years to achieve, 4 times as long. Okay, but they did achieve it in the end. And so by 1974, the US essentially a lot of its easy to drill and easy to access oil began completely running out, and there was lots of talk around peak oil in the US. And obviously the big events that ruined the relationship between Iran and US as they were importing was the 1979 revolution, where the Islamic revolution in Iran, it transformed the country. It overthrew the Shah and the monarchy, and essentially became US, went from US's greatest ally to one of its greatest enemies overnight. And that really strengthened the relationship between Israel and Iran, became public enemy number one. And this was around the time that Netanyahu started pushing some of the policies around sanctioning, started paying more and more to Congress, and started dictating US policies in order to draw it into some of the Iraqi invasions and everything that came next as well, in order to destabilize the region. And so essentially a bunch of the oil from Iran, it drew up overnight at the same time, and tensions started to become greater and greater. And this started to kickstart really the tensions between Saudi Arabia and Iran. And Saudi Arabia started exporting more and more oil. It only had 33 million population. America had 350 million population, and America just needed to import more and more and more. And that relationship grew stronger and stronger and stronger. Round about the time the 1980s, the price of oil collapsed. And at that time, because Texas was still producing oil, it went deep into an oil-focused recession at the time. And at that time, they were still trying to become oil independent, but were still a net importer. Fast forward all the way about 30 years later, around about 2005, the US was importing more oil from abroad than ever. And so it was really hard to achieve that because the growth was outpacing the production of oil. And about 60% of US oil was coming in from imports. But at that time, and this is where it comes into really bringing it around to the Bitcoin mining industry and the energy industry, a technological innovation and a breakthrough happened within Texas, and oil and gas within Texas. They started to combine basically petroleum engineers with some innovation from geologists around being able to dig horizontally. They put these two technologies together and invented fracking. And fracking was a complete transformation and changed the game. Essentially, fracking changed the energy and all of the different companies and all of the industries, where it could essentially take and create crude oil and export natural gas out of rocks that were deposited hundreds and millions of years ago into the ocean. Turns out that Texas was once covered by an ocean, and there were many hundreds of millions of years ago, it was covered by an ocean, and there were vast supplies of oil and gas that could be extracted from Texas using this fracking technology. Overnight, and through pushing that innovation, Texas essentially became the largest fracker, and again, the largest producer, and it was discovered all around, and it started exporting all around the world and completely changed the geopolitical tensions and dependency upon the Middle East. One field became the second largest field on the planet for extracting oil and gas, only behind the largest one in Saudi Arabia. And they had the largest field in Saudi Arabia and the second largest in Texas. Oil and gas exports from Saudi Arabia, basically, they had a real choke point because in order to get that oil across from Saudi Arabia over to America, it needed to go through lots of different choke points in the sea. And so therefore, for Saudi Arabia, it had to keep geopolitical stability with a lot of these different choke points in the sea in order to export to the world markets. The same with Russia. And this is why Russia has an important relationship with Syria, because in order to get their exports into the Mediterranean Sea, it managed to get itself an import. It managed to get itself a port in Syria so that it could export across the Mediterranean Sea. But the problem is it then has to go through lots of different NATO allied ports. And so the sea becomes geopolitically the area where a lot of the tensions, and this is why Russia had to strengthen its relationships with Iran. And we covered in previous episodes, and that became a way for Russia by strengthening its relationship with Iran in order to get oil across to different nations like India, and then also strengthen its relationship with China. And as those sanctions became more and more important, it started to export a lot less, and therefore started to make sure that those corridors were geopolitically safe and sound. But with Texas, it is located in an area where essentially it has complete geopolitical stability, because it's exporting it across to all the different places in America, risk-free, and it can have its relationships across the Gulf of Mexico, and therefore it can have access to the world's oceans from there. And that's why pretty much it has a free reign to become an important exporter. There's only one little, kink in that, and that is it needs to retain geopolitical stability with Cuba, because Cuba became very important in exporting those oil. Interestingly, just the last 2 weeks, Cuba decided that it now wants to join BRICS and become allied in 2024 around the de-dollarization mission. So that becomes an important one to watch in maintaining that important corridor for America and its exports as well. But essentially, within 5 years, between 2009 and 2014, Texas became more and more important, and it tripled its oil production and its exports. And by 2023, where we are just around the corner, fracking enabled Texas to become the producer of 43% of all the oil in the US. 25% of oil production, of the US production for natural gas also was being done within Texas. And now Texas produces even more oil than Iraq as well, which obviously was massively destabilized as a result of sitting between Saudi Arabia and Iran and causing all the issues between Iran and Saudi Arabia. If it were a country, Texas would be the fourth largest producer of oil in the world, just behind, and it would actually be just behind the entire United States outside and Russia and Saudi Arabia. So that's why Texas is so important. Texas actually produces as well more natural gas, which is needed for electricity, than either China or Qatar individually. Again, if Texas was its own country, it would possess basically 1/4 of oil of the highest production of all natural gas, which is just behind Iran itself as well. So not only is it oil, it is also natural gas, and the world is transitioning over to more electricity becoming more and more important over oil as oil reaches its peaks. Texas essentially became the most important also for crude oil refinery, which means you can take the crude oil and you can turn it into something that actually can be used for gasoline, for jet fuel, and for anything else that needs to be used as well. So now it can refine more oil and gasoline and diesel and jet fuel, and it can refine more oil than India as well, and every other country in the world except Russia and China. So America, through Texas, achieved a very, very important geopolitical feat. It is now and won back the prize for the world's largest oil producer and took over from Saudi Arabia. Around about 2018, it achieved that. And by 2019, it actually became, it hit its imports at its peak, where about 60% previously, let me get this right. Previously, 60% of its peak of imports and oil were around about 2005. Now it's down to less than 3%. So it went from 60% down to 3%. US has essentially become the world's largest producer of natural gas, and Texas can use natural gas in order to produce much, much cheaper electricity. And the US now has the most reliable source of electricity within its country because it built within Texas, something that all of the Bitcoin miners in America started to use, which was the grid. The grid in Texas became the primary factor in encouraging Bitcoin miners to come over to the US when geopolitically China decided that it was going to implement a ban on Bitcoin mining. Now, it never announced it, but it more recently reversed that policy. If you're looking at data, about 60% of mining pools were connected to miners in China. And now that went down to about 20%, and about 40% started to pop up across America. This is because of the grid and the cheapness of electricity, and many of those miners started to plug them in America, and this was a very, very good geopolitical move for America across those corridors. Right, I think we've got about 15 minutes left as well. Let's move forward a little bit to when that started to happen. That all started to happen around the Bitcoin halving of 2020. And then obviously we saw the Russian invasion of Ukraine in 2022. EU started to reduce many of its oil imports from Russia and many of its natural gas imports. We saw Russia become closer to China and Iran, and we started to move to that geopolitical, more divided, those more divided nation between America providing for Europe and Russia providing between Iran and China. This is why there is currently an investigation that's happening between America's role in blowing up the Nord Stream pipe, which was where Germany was getting all of its natural gas, and the pipeline that was built between Russia and Germany, and the terrorist attack that was around blowing up the Nord Stream pipe that allowed for that to happen. And America is currently being investigated for its role in that. This is what also led to the BRICS de-dollarization. And by 2023, essentially, US became the largest provider of natural gas to the European Union. 20% of its total imports came from America, and that was only behind Norway, which is responsible for about 31% of the natural gas imports into the European Union. So it found a way of taking a bunch of that business by blowing up pipelines, which it hasn't admitted to yet. But Texas also used this innovation in order to become the largest producer of renewable energy as well. Essentially, in Texas, you can now generate electricity from wind power because it is actually one of the windiest parts in the US. And right now, there's about 150 wind farms in Texas that can produce about 30,000 megawatts of power. And that provides approximately 60% of all the electricity within Texas based upon wind power. If Texas were a country, let's use one of those as well, it would rank 5th in the largest in the world for wind power generation as well. 5th in the world for natural gas, and 4th in the world, as we said, for oil. But it also is one of the hottest countries in the world as well. And so for solar energy potential, it accounts for approximately 4% of gas and electricity in Texas as well, from solar as well. So not only does it have oil and natural gas, but it also has one of the most efficient for wind, solar, and even nuclear. to combine to produce about 1/3 of all the Texas electricity needs can be done through solar, wind, and nuclear. So renewable energy as well became really important. Now, what did we learn about Bitcoin mining when we've covered that? Well, let me cover a little bit about Bitcoin mining, and then we'll wrap off this one as well, because now we know the history and the geopolitical importance that now America can become 100% America first and independent, and there is no longer need to have its dependency and occupation across the Middle East, other than if the defense lobbies are trying to create destability in order to support the US military industrial complex industry as well. So to give a little bit of background on mining, let's go through a little bit of my background. So I actually started mining Bitcoin around 2014, as I covered in Iceland. We did it as part of a product in Bank to the Future, where our investors could gain access to the first Bitcoin bond. And we created a Bitcoin mining-backed security where it was producing daily Bitcoin dividends from using volcano power and geothermal electricity. And the game of mining, for those of you that don't know, is basically you have to buy these specialist equipment called ASICs. And what those ASICs do, they're special equipment that you purchase. They cannot do anything else other than basically trying to solve complex mathematical problems. And that is what basically creates a record of all the different transactions in the Bitcoin blockchain. They are trying to essentially predict a string of numbers, and the more electricity you push into those ASICs, the more numbers it can predict at a faster rate. And the entire Bitcoin industry, it is like a national lottery where each Bitcoin miner and each ASIC is trying to be selected for solving the mathematical problem faster than anybody else. You can solve it faster by having a faster ASIC, cheaper electricity, more electricity in order to put to it. Basically, all of the other guesses, other than the one that wins in the national lottery, are kind of wasted electricity. But they all create a copy of the blockchain. The blockchain agrees across all these different ASICs that are being mined in all these different countries. And they add a version of the truth. And by keeping the block small, it means that it is very cheap in order to operate a node where you can verify all those transactions, and you get this amazing network of the world's largest geopolitically neutral and completely country independent version of the truth that can disrupt central banking by keeping all of the different transactions in the blocks that happen. And so every 10 minutes, all of the transactions are included in a block. No one miner can essentially take over the network and change a version of the truth. In order to do that, they have to control over 50% of the hash power. If a country wanted to do that, they'd have to bomb all of these different locations. They'd have to also gain control of the network for, over 50% of the network. Unfortunately, geopolitically, these miners are, located in America. They're located in Iran. They're located in Russia. They're located in China. They're located across Africa, and anywhere electricity can be mined at the cheapest rate. Nodes there all over the world as well. There's over 100,000 of them to make sure that it is geopolitically neutral. And as long as they can run those nodes very cheaply by keeping the block small, we make sure that we can have those records. This is why, essentially, if you have been watching any of the block war debates and things that have come out recently, smaller blocks won because the community reached consensus that decentralization was more important than cheaper transaction fees, and you could have a layer 2 where people could build on top of those, and in order to compete, in order to make cheaper fees, but keep, can have more centralization, but keep the layer 1 on the Bitcoin blockchain, cheap. And essentially that was the block war debate. That's the economics of mining that I covered. If you want a 15-minute overview of that, have a look at the video that I created called the post Bitcoin mining halving update that was posted onto my YouTube channel. And I went through all these different things as well. So that's how Bitcoin mining works. Now, the key to running a successful Bitcoin miner is your ability to do a few things very well. Firstly, is access electricity cheaper than anyone else. And so that's why geopolitically, countries are now deciding, like El Salvador, to mine Bitcoin with some of their excess electricity. Also, electricity providers are saying, what if we have wasted electricity? Could we chuck some of that over to Bitcoin mining? And what if we could repurpose and really use Bitcoin mining in order to generate returns, in order to support the growth of renewable innovation within our country? And so that's what it is being used for across the sovereign side and some of the large infrastructure plays. Also, you need to be able to acquire some of that equipment cheaper than anyone else. Most of it is produced in China. And so you have this good geopolitical stability, like the equipment is being produced mainly in China. Now, America can try and compete. Other countries can try and compete to produce ASICs. But if you can get that equipment over and you've got the cheapest form of electricity, then inevitably Bitcoin mining starts to go over to some of the most efficient places in the world as well. It also is important to keep some of that equipment because it's really, really noisy. If you went into our Bitcoin mine, you have to, cover your ears because it's so noisy and it's damn hot. And so you have to be able to cool those equipment at the cheapest rate possible. And so things like when we did it in Iceland, we repurposed natural energy from the cold climate in order to cool that. Now, Texas is damn hot. And so some of the miners like Riot, which is a large public miner, they get a direct source into the river in order to be able to push some of that water up and cool some of that equipment. And the innovation is getting better and better and better in order to mine Bitcoin cheaper and cheaper and cheaper. In some areas within Texas, they're taking, going right from the oil production, being able to repurpose that into natural gas, then take some of that natural gas in order to refactor it into electricity. And then that electricity is going straight into the ASIC miners, and they're being able to go completely vertical integrated in order to be able to pull some of the gas straight from the well into the generator. And this produces electricity that they can plug straight into the ASIC. ASIC, by the way, is called an application-specific integration circuit. Sorry for going geeky as well. They can really control a much, much greater degree of the process. So this is the industry. That is why approximately 40% of the hash power is now being done in America. What did America do? Well, they started to actually get back to their capitalist roots as well. Despite the Federal Reserve being used by the banking lobby in order to try and put a tax on Bitcoin, the capital markets decided to allow a lot of these Bitcoin mining companies to go public. And so you now have approximately, about 20 different companies that are now mining in America, in Texas, using the most efficient equipment that they purchased from China at the best rates, and using chips that come in and produced in Taiwan in order to allow for that. Why Taiwan becomes geopolitically important as well. So Bitcoin really has an important role in China, an important role in Taiwan, an important role in America, an important role in Russia, an important role in Iran. And so you get that geopolitically neutrality that is also competing with central banking. So now you have the US capital markets that have been raising the funding for approximately 20 different companies. They have been using a combination of debt funding as well as equity funding. You get many different private companies as well that are competing. You get stable coins that are using some of their excess profits from lending money to the US government, the interest that companies like Tether are receiving from lending to the US government is being reinvested into Uruguay and Ethiopia and different countries in order to produce more and more efficient renewable energy and innovation in wind and solar and nuclear and volcano-powered geothermal electricity. And essentially, it is creating a resistance movement against central banking by allowing people to own their own money, spend their own money, and combat the money printing of the central banking lobby, and compete directly against it, and a force that defunds the military-industrial complex as well. And in fact, it is being, many of the lobby groups are saying, you got to place taxes upon Bitcoin mining. And so guess what? The highest lobby groups, the banking lobby, the defense lobby, they also contribute to many of the Congress members, and the Congress members decide that they want to introduce bills in order to put special Bitcoin taxes just upon those countries. The Senate people that are independent of that recognize that it's creating lots of jobs within Texas. They resist against that. And, they're creating all of the usual kind of talking points. They're saying things like, that small, basically Bitcoin is mining more and using more electricity than a small country. In fact, that is true. Currently, the security behind Bitcoin that makes it the most secure network that no cryptocurrency can even come close, it actually uses more electricity than a country like Argentina. That's how secure it is. But what does that country do? Well, you have to compare that to the global use of technology using electricity. And it is minuscule compared to electric cars and, computers and all the other different types of industries. But then you also have to compare that to banking. Banking has a massive infrastructure. So it is an efficiency improvement. But who does it compete with? It also competes with central banking. Central banking is converting countries from capitalism to socialism because it increases the massive amount of debt. It uses the IMF in order to export global inflation that encourages those countries to print more of their countries, which is creating geopolitical tensions, which then is used to encourage countries to go deeper and deeper into war. So Bitcoin is a peaceful resistance movement against what I've always called the proof of weapons network, which is fiat currency that got taken over by banks. So by competing with that, you essentially get to go through stable coins from government direct to stable coins, which is full reserve banking, which exists upon different types of consensus mechanisms. And we'll cover more of that in different videos. But Bitcoin gives people the ability to have a resistance movement against that, and therefore directly can impact the more people that use it, the more you have issues within the banking system, the more you have people using Bitcoin as savings and stable coins as full reserve banking. So Texas, they obviously resist against some of those special taxes, and they don't go through because miners can sell electricity even back to the grid. And some of those miners, they're doing things like cartelment, where they're buying hedges in for the grid using wasted electricity, and it creates this incredibly efficient market where they can supply cheaper electricity by buying those hedges during times when people don't need that electricity. And they can sell it when people, they wake up, for example, or when people go to bed. And you have this really efficient market that is showing the world, really. And hopefully that can get exported to different nations across Africa and the South Americas and different industries that can really, really push everything forward and repurpose that wasted electricity and use market forces in order to do that. So as we said, this can drive sustainable energy, and Bitcoin shows what it always does, that is one of the best free markets out there. So that then brings us to where we are today. The 2024 election, where everybody is deciding what is their policy on Bitcoin right now. Well, the Bitcoin miner tax bill was actually removed, and that's because the Bitcoin industry starts doing what they know they need to do in order to help politics along, which is you have to contribute to Congress people. So in the political environment, a lot of the different Congress people, RFK, Trump, and Biden, start deciding that they're going to become more aligned with the Bitcoin industry. So Trump starts pushing a pro-crypto narrative, and you started to see all the videos that were coming out. But what does President Biden do? Biden decides, in his infinite wisdom, that this is a good time to start shutting down one of the Bitcoin mining companies because they are connected to buying equipment from China and using Chinese pools in Wyoming. And so Biden has shown that he has no allegiance to the industry, no support for the massive innovation that's happening in Texas, which is one of the most geopolitically strategic for natural gas, for Bitcoin mining, for energy production, for renewable energy across America. And obviously Trump is going to take advantage of that. And RFK is coming along and saying, we'll just raise money from the Bitcoin community. And so as we move forward, it becomes a dead cert to me, a slam dunk, that Trump is the next president of the United States. And the Bitcoin vote and the pro-crypto vote is obviously going to go across to Trump, away from Biden, at the same time as all the different geopolitical trends. So get used to it. You heard it here. I did say that Trump would win those elections that Trump won and Biden would lose. But now I'm saying it's Trump again. And that is because Bitcoin and crypto is becoming geopolitically and strategically important as we move forward in a minor scale. And rewind to the beginning of this video if you didn't watch it, when I covered some of the different bills that were being introduced, and laser eyes going on Congress members and Senate members. But don't underestimate the power of the banking lobby in trying to reverse some of those decisions. So be vigilant. And always remember, you are alive at one of the most interesting and exciting times in financial history. Some are going to get wrecked. Others are going to do really well. Remember to head over to simondixon.com and head over to the Wealth Building Solutions, where there's lots of free resources and lots of membership sites that you can sign up to. And I'm going to be doing, as always, just after Bitcoin halving, my animation and free video series to make sure that everybody is aware of everything they can do to build and protect their wealth. But we're going to be doing it with peace, with love, with unity. And I hope you can see that the resistance movement against central banking, the Bitcoin resistance movement, becomes more and more important, and more of people will join us as we transition to this world of Bitcoin, central bank digital currencies. And what I'm going to be doing next week, if we have time, depending on how much news comes out in This Week in Bitcoin, This Week in Geopolitics, and This Week in Macro, if there's not too much side, I'm going to go deep into the Taiwan and China situation so you can understand the trade wars that are being fought right now with financial weapons of mass destruction being thrown across between America and China, and the importance of the AI and semiconductor industry. It will blow your mind. Like, share, retweet, subscribe, wherever you are. And hopefully this went across all the different social networks. And I will see you this time next week in Bitcoin Hard Talk episode 32. That's going to do it for episode 31. Peace.